Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Modern Brewer Podcast with me, your host, Chris Lewington. In this episode, we'll be discussing both sides of the contract brewing world. What you need to know to be a contract brewer, and of course, what you need to know if your beer is being contract brewed. We'll be discussing how to choose your contract partner, how to manage the relationship between producer and customer, should you make a service level agreement, and how you can maximize success of the contract brewing partnership. But before we delve into the world of contract brewing, a question. Has your brewery ever considered how big its entire carbon footprint is? Have you ever wondered how you can achieve net zero? Well, you can join breweries like Deya, Gypsy Hill, and Brixton by signing up to Zero Carbon Accountancy. They accurately and efficiently measure, report, and reduce your brewery's carbon emissions. Check them out at zevero.earth. And Zevero is spelt Zevero. So, during my career, I managed a healthy amount of contract brewing, managing 2 brands of beer in 7 different breweries across 3 countries that accounts for over 50% of annual production. But with me today is Francesco Lo Bue. He managed the contract production on the other side at Red Church Brewery before becoming a senior brewer at Beavertown, and he currently works at a brewer at Brewer in Zurich, a brewery that's very close to my heart. So, all the way from Zurich, welcome to the show, Francesco Lo Bue.
Hello, Chris. Hello, listeners. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, I'm going to lie, my facade isn't going to last very long. For the listeners' sake, Francesco is a close friend of mine, as is quite common with some of the guests I have on the show. To be honest, since I've known him, I've called him Frenzy. So I do apologize if the veil slips a little. But Francesco, why don't you give the listeners a little more information on who you are?
I'm a brewer. I've been a brewer for the past 9 years across different countries, starting from Italy, then moving to the UK, where I spent 7 years. And now I'm in Zurich, Switzerland, and working as a brewer and in a small brew pub, producing some world-class German beers and a couple of IPAs as well.
So you spent some time at Red Church and you were contract brewing on the other side. So you're allowing brewers to come in and contract brewing some beer for people. How was that for you?
Well, it was very challenging and for sure interesting because you get to learn how someone else brews without having to work in that brewery. And it's always useful to get exposure to different methods and technique. And in that case, brewing neck oil, being myself a big fan of that beer, it was very cool, and you can see how simple ingredients can make such a great product.
Yeah, it's awesome. I think one of the things we're going to start with this show is what to look for in a contract partner. So, of course, there's hundreds of reasons you could pick and should pick a contract partner. But I think from a high-level view, these are the most important I see, and I'd love to hear your take after it. But a big reason to pick a contract partner is that they're a bigger brewery than you, because that means they can make beer cheaper. They often have appropriate quality controls and equipment, and basically have the expertise to do it. I would also say, to make a double point on that, definitely picking a contract brewery that has good quality control. So when you visit the brewery, which is totally essential before any beer is brewed, you go meet the people and walk around the brewery. You know, you're not just there to meet the people as well, but you're also there to assess everything. So keeping an eye on how the general hygiene levels, the practices you see, checking out if they have SOPs and if people are following them. Because I often notice what's dirty outside the tank will more likely end up being in that tank too. So a really good way just to make sure they have good quality control. And you can check that pretty simply by either walking around the brewery or just asking some simple questions. Another great way to ensure that you're going to get a good contract partner is to make sure they make the same style as beer as you. So, I mean, I've had to go into large production facilities before and explain to them what dry hopping is, which is not an ideal foundation to a contract brewing partnership, because, you know, dry hopping isn't just as easy as putting hops in the top of the tank or around the tank. You also have to get rid of them at some point. And for brewers that aren't set up for that, it's quite a new feat. We were buying pieces of equipment for people to be using, and we're having to go in and write SOPs and teach people how to use it. So I would say always making sure they're making similar style beers to you. So again, if they're making loads of IPAs and you want to make a lager, perhaps not the best contract partner for you. And then, finally, you got to pick people as well as production. So, check their understanding of the brewing process. It's not a crazy thing to check, but also very important, because when things go wrong, and they will, they're the people who's going to be in control of your beer. So you want to make sure that they're up to a standard where they can make the correct decisions. And also, ultimately, that they're good people, because you will have to work with them. They're not working for you, and you're not working for them. So making sure, basically, they aren't overly opinionated and very stern in one direction, and they're going to respect the way that you're doing things. One thing I will say is water is important, but it's not vital, as I'm sure I'm going to discuss later on. But for you, Francesco, what do you think are the most important things to look for in a brewery partner?
Well, for sure, communication is key. So you need to find somebody that is good on communication. So any follow-up or any issue gets communicated in time, so people can take action like in a timely manner. And it's good if you can find a partner that can deliver on time with all the products in specs. That's always nice. And there must be mutual trust, as you said. Like, it needs to be good people to work with, and in the end, they're producing something for you, so it needs to eat your request, because you are the person who is paying for that beer.
Yeah, it's a good point with the communication. I think if they're not responding to your emails early days, then it's not a good start to the relationship going down the line. Actually, on the other side, Francesco, as a brewery facilitating contract brewing, what should you be looking for in a partner?
Well, that's my opinion, but I think that it makes sense to let brew in your brewery who's going to guarantee you a certain volume output. Because to adapt a recipe in a new brewery takes a lot of work. So it would make more sense if this brewery can actually guarantee you a certain amount of production. What do you think about it?
Yeah, definitely. You should be having a contract partner that's giving you guaranteed volumes. I mean, guaranteed is strong, but at least giving you minimum volumes. Otherwise, it is a lot of work to establish the start. It's probably the most intensive part of it all. So, would agree.
Then for sure you want to look for a brewery that has the right equipment, as you said, to actually produce your beer. So, or maybe have different equipment, but you're able to adapt your recipe to it.
Yeah, because I mean, I've dealt with, I think, 4 or 5 different systems making the same beer. So it's possible, but it's just the equipment necessarily isn't like a snagging point, but it's just making sure that it is possible to do it, as you said, making sure it is possible to actually get the beer that you want out of it. So how did you manage the relationship between customer and your brewery?
Well, we had a very bright and tight specification, so we were trying to hit all our targets. That said that we didn't have a lab at the time, so we were sending our samples down to Beavertown to be checked, which was always a little bit thrilling to see how we been doing, how we doing all right, did we mess it up this time? So, and communication, it was very important, because every time we had a doubt, as it wasn't one of our core range beer, you always need to communicate what's happening and how do you think you're going to sort that problem out, or if they have another way to approach it. So I think that's always important, because it builds trust between the two parts, rather than go ahead and do as you do for your beer, and then maybe it's not how they would do. So the actual relationship, it was great. I mean, sometimes there is a bit of pressure, especially for volumes. So maybe something goes wrong, or like a fermentation happens a little bit slower, and that delays the production. So sometimes you have a bit of pressure to deal with.
Yeah, totally. Managing that relationship is key, isn't it, really? Again, communication is always essential, but maybe something to look for in a contract partner as well, is making sure that at least one of you has the way of measuring or analyzing the beer, especially for whatever you deem to be important. I know that we had quite intense specs and not everyone had those pieces of equipment, but we would always ensure that it was tested before. But yeah, I think that the relationship is all about ultimately communication, isn't it? The same with nearly all relationships in all fields of brewing and separate as well. So how would you say you create a successful relationship within a contract brewery partnership?
Well, again, you want to be supported. So you want to have like open people on the other side that are happy to take on board your decisions and your methods. So you need to sit down and talk about how you want to do it. And on the other hand, there needs to be other people that accept it and they want to maybe do things differently than what they do usually. So that's pretty important. Then once you have the right spec and the place where you contract is able to actually hit all of them, then I think that strengthens the relationship a lot more, because most of the time happens that brewery are not able to hit the specs for whatever reason, and that gets a bit stressful from both sides, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, how do you create a successful relationship? Is be successful, I guess, is the
yeah. Nail it.
Is,
it's gonna be no problem.
Yeah, exactly. Nail it, and everything's all going to be okay. Yeah, I think because I found personally managing the relationship was sometimes very difficult. It's important that the brewery you're brewing in knows that they are making your beer, not basically being told how to make beer. It's such an important difference. There's a lot of times you're like, can you do this? And they're like, well, that doesn't make sense. And it's like, well, okay, maybe that doesn't make sense to the way that you make beer or you've been taught to make beer, but this is how we make our beer, which is really what that dynamic needs to be. You know, from the offset, that needs to be set in stone, that it's just, look, I appreciate what you lot are doing. That's amazing. But what we're here to do is make our beer the way that tastes like our beer. And the only way we're going to do that is if we basically do it, not our way, but basically our way. I think you can still learn a lot from people's input. I'm not saying ignore that, but I think when you're coming to make your beer in someone else's brewery, it just needs make sure that they understand that it is your product and it's your recipe and it's the way that you're making it. Yeah, I mean, everyone's got opinions, haven't they, on how to make beer? But there's sometimes to share them, there's sometimes not.
It's all about the approach, in my opinion. If you go humble and you know that you're brewing for someone else, I mean, big takeaway there.
Yeah, definitely. There's big takeaways. You can learn a lot, and you can learn both ways. Definitely from when I've been into other breweries, I've learned a whole heap about how to make beer in a different way. And maybe we've actually taken some things away from there and improved the recipe. So it's, yeah, as I said, it's important to create that relationship, as you said, just to make sure that it's set in stone, that it is a business partnership and that they're there to make your beer. It kind of leads to, how do you make beer taste the same at two different facilities? Because that is the ultimate challenge. And that's the goal of contract brewing, isn't it? So you're not just increasing your volume, but you also want to make sure that volume is, to the best of your ability, the same beer that it would be if it was made in your production facility. And for that to happen, you have to fundamentally and analytically understand your beer. Every single control point, from, of course, water analysis, but malt intake to final pack, as much as you can measure or have measured for you and ready and with specifications, as Francesco's already alluded to, it's only then are you really in a position to emulate your beer in another facility, because it's really difficult for someone, and I'm sure this is what you can say, Francesco, it's really difficult for someone to make a beer if they don't have proper specifications on how to do so.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, data don't lie. So if you stick to those numbers, you're most likely going to have the same product.
Yeah, I mean, sensory is an analytical process, but it's still, in essence, subjective in some ways, and in the majority of the way it's subjective. So that is where you don't want to truly end up, is in that debate of what tastes like what and what smells like what. So the best way to do that is before you get to the sensory panel, before that beer is in that sensory panel, is have as many control points and specifications that they can hit and that you as the contract brewer can hit And therefore, it takes away a little bit of the subjectivity at the end of the day. Of course, it's very difficult to get an entire brewing process from start to finish into a document, but it is kind of essential on how to make beer taste the same.
True. And I mean, sensory, it plays a big part, especially when you have a huge dry hop. So
yeah,
that makes everything a little bit more interesting, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. And another thing is like, where are the hops coming from? Some people are using their own hops and having them sent, and some people are buying into contracts of other breweries because they're getting a better deal. So if that's the case, and again, there's always going to be slight differences. I think one thing I was always really keen on was basically trying to foresee the problem before they exist, which is kind of an obvious thing to say, but it's one of the things you really have to sit down and go through with a fine-tooth comb and analyze their brewery compared to your brewery, and how that is going to affect the taste. I mean, I've got a good example. It's very obvious, but it was quite interesting. So we went into one brewery that we chose, and their water profile was just, I mean, it was totally opposite to ours. So they were like super heavy on sulfates. I mean, like more than I've ever seen. And our water profile was like 2-1 in favor of chloride. So you're naturally going into that going, we're going to be fighting bitterness this whole way, or bitterness perception the whole way. So then obviously you control the IBUs, but also you have to look at final pH, gravity, clarity, and you just got to basically really focus on the things that are definitely going to cause you problems. If they're not controlled. I mean, with any sort of tannins, anything like that, it's going to accentuate that bitterness even more. It's going to be a big problem. So we tried. I mean, not every batch was successful at the start, but we did manage to get there in the end. But it's really interesting because they're sort of the things you look at where you're like, here's going to be a problem. I've looked at your brewery, looked at your water. This is what that's going to cause. Let's fight this. So they ended up being, about 50% of the IBUs down compared to what the standard recipe was, just so we could try get like balance that bitterness a little bit, or that astringency. So yeah, it was just one of those things. I think to make the beer taste the same, you need to make sure that you have assessed the production facility to the best of your ability and how you're going to emulate what your beer is in there.
Yes, for sure. And as well, sending your own ingredients, like that helps a lot.
Yeah.
Especially on the hops side. I would definitely, if I was contracting somewhere else, I would like to send my own hops rather than relying on some other supplier.
Yeah, I think it definitely helps. We did both. And yeah, I would say that sending your own hops is good, but it depends on your brewery size and your contract amounts and volumes. If you haven't got a lot extra and you end up getting off the spot market, for example, then it can actually be more beneficial to use someone else's contract. So there are ways around it, but yeah, I would say if in a perfect world, you'd be sending mostly your own ingredients, especially at hops, etc. I think malt, as long as it's the same specs and brand, you could use any of the maltsters for that.
Yeah, I agree. If you want to give consistency, especially, that's super important.
Yeah. So how important were the specs for you then, Francesco? What were you looking for when someone was giving you a spec sheet? What were the specs you were actually looking for to really help you nail that beer?
Well, for sure, the water profile to start with. So how much salt and at which point of the brewing process you were adding the salt. We were looking even into attenuation and, of course, OG, FG. That's important to give you an idea. And different techniques, and the dry hopping, and seeing like how much that IBUs was dropping after maybe using some agent for clarifying. So that was always interesting to see the final report and see, okay, specification is 35 IBUs. After adding that amount of silicate, it dropped to 30. So maybe we need to adjust that. So the specification we were looking for, of course, was bitterness, ABV, and trying to hit the same color and the level of haziness. That has always been our struggle because we didn't have a centrifuge. So that was the real challenge. Get it as clear as the one made in Beavertown, in this case.
from those specifications, were you getting ranges or were you getting specific numbers, and how were you interpreting them when you were getting them through into your brewery?
So ideally you had a perfect number to hit, but that's very difficult. So you had a range. So try to be in between that range. So the range of Beavertown at the time were fairly tight compared to our one. So it was always very challenging, but gives you also satisfaction when you were hitting those targets, like right in the middle of that range.
Yeah, and what would you do if it was out of specification, for example?
Well, we were getting communicated that after we were sending our sample, and then we were thinking about taking some action within some blending, in case the color was too high, or if the ABV was, again, out of spec. Like, the only thing we could do at the time was blending with another batch and trying to fix that issue. Haziness-wise, again, we were getting result of what was our haze, and in case it was too high, we had to add more silicate in order to take it down.
Yeah, interesting. One of the things we did over the course of our time my time in contract brewing was we'd create these service level agreements, or abbreviations as SLA, and they could be put in place which contractually details the specifications and acceptable limits and what you are allowed to do to hit those if you're out of those limits, and sort of the reporting procedure should you do them. Now, it's quite a weighty document to create. It's actually really good if you're making large volumes somewhere else. It's nice to have something to fall back on if something isn't correct. And yeah, so service level agreements, they were a nightmare at first, and some brewers don't like using them. So you can take them to some contract brewing facilities and they're like, no, we don't want to do this because this is not possible for us to hit this repeatedly, which is actually quite interesting. But the challenge of having one in place to the brewer and to you was actually really good. It was a really good way of ensuring that your quality was going to be done. You do have to have quite a good amount of analysis, and it's detailed. I mean, it's a contract. It's never really you're not going to go to court over it, I wouldn't say, mainly because you probably don't have the resources to go to court, and also it's just not worth it. But they are there as an agreement that both contracts parties sign it, and it's like this is what happens, which I thought was a really nice something that we developed later on during the agreement. Now, some people might be sitting there thinking that's a bit intense, but when things don't go right, and let me tell you right now, something will go wrong down the line. It genuinely always does, not just in contract brewing, but in brewing. And when it's in your brewery, it's a lot easier to manage. When things are going wrong in other people's breweries, it's way harder to manage. And also when you're writing these, so it's better to have these in place so that when something does go wrong, there is something to talk about. I will say, though, one of my takeaways that we took from writing them quite a few times is actually just be in the mindset that the beer will most likely never truly be the same as the one you make in your brewery. So you kind of have to get over that when you're writing these. You can get we probably wrote things far too tight at the start because we're so rigid on trying to make it taste the same. And actually, it is very difficult to emulate your beer consistently in someone else's brewery to a level where it's passing a blind sensory panel that's identical. It's very, very unlikely, especially when you're introducing things like dry hopping. I think for lagers it's probably a lot easier. But when you're introducing the complexity of dry hopping and packaging, etc., I think it's quite difficult. So you kind of have to get that and move on. So if you are going to write a service level agreement, which I would recommend to anyone if they're going into a large contract agreement, is that write it understanding that it's not going to be perfect, but it's there to fall back on when things don't work. I don't think that there was one in place at Red Church at the time, but it was something we did when we moved to like 1 million hectare a year brewery sort of place. So it's a good question to you, Francesco, because obviously you've brewed in many different countries. So what happens when the brewery that you're contracting is in another country?
Well, that makes things a little bit more challenging. And it happened to me personally when I was thinking to start my own brewery back 2019, right before the pandemic. And the country was Spain. And I didn't trust them. So I went there and I brewed my own beer on their kit, which makes it a little bit challenging. On another note, when you contract on very small volumes and it's your first beer, you kind of want to brew it yourself if you're a brewer. So that kind of came out naturally. So the only thing I did was brewing it with my technique and my method, and ensuring that at least those specifications were getting right. Then I handed over everything that was dry hopping and packaging, and fortunately the beer was great. But again, communication, it's so important, and if there is a lack of communication, it makes both parts very stressed, and that it might not help for future collaboration.
Yeah, I also had some experience with brewing beer in different countries. It adds a lot of complexity. I think there's probably three main reasons. One, just you can't necessarily go there and taste the beer as easy as you could if it's in the UK. So if something does go wrong during the process, it's always best to go and taste what's going on. And it's a lot more difficult when the beer is in a different country. So that was definitely one. Another thing is cultures. So cultures of brewing are very different in different countries. Sometimes it can be quite difficult to go there as a brewer from a different sort of brewing culture and try and work in that brewery or around that brewery. And yeah, the third thing is transport. And we're going to ignore the cost of transport. But one thing that previously we have been burnt on is the temperature of that transport. So making sure that if it's coming across in the summer and it's coming across from Europe, for example, into the UK, then it's incredibly important that that beer is either chilled or has temperature control loggers in it, because sometimes things happen, gets held up in customs, for example, and it's a hot weekend across in Europe, that beer can start to cook. So I think whenever you're considering brewing in a different country that's not for sale in that country, for example, you're bringing it back in, is ensuring that the transport is really well looked after. It sounds kind of very obvious, but I'm telling you, when you've just gone through the whole process from start to finish of making the first big batch of beer and you're all excited and everything's done, you've gone to the brewery, it's tasted it, it's really great, and you're like, okay, I'm happy, this is all good. And then the transport cooks it a bit. You can very quickly, you can't believe that you just get so happy because you've done all your hard work, you feel like, and then something as simple as transport goes and messes it up. So yeah, there's the other thing is about bringing in a different country is definitely the transport of the product of where it's going.
Yeah, that's such a shame. After doing all that work.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, Francesco, you actually kind of touched on it, but maybe you can elaborate a bit more on how contract brewing affected the beers of the place that you were brewing in. So having a different company come in or a different brewery come in and changing, what did actually change on the techniques did you take away on your own beers?
Well, you need to consider that at the time, even now, like Beavertown was a big company with lots of experts and new technique or different techniques. And for us in Red Church back in the days, we didn't know all that information, and we didn't have all that background, or even, having enough people in the room to discuss it and come out with new ideas. So for us and for our core range at the time, I think it's been like a great chance for improvement and using different products, different agents, and just experimenting on a different beer and using the expertise of another brewery in order to improve your own. I think that's a great takeaway. Like we were very, very happy and excited to have the opportunity to brew a beer for such a like a big brewery like Beaverton at the time. And I'm pretty sure like all our core range like really, really improved, even our lager. So 2019, it won best lager in the UK. So I think brewing neck oil helped to improve even a completely different beer, like a lager.
Yeah, I actually was also on the same side of contract brewing as you once, and you were as well. And we were brewing a big American brand's beer. And I have to admit, it was actually really fascinating how much, whilst their process was completely different to ours, actually the brewery was also a lot bigger than ours. And being able to talk to the people at that brewery about their beer and your beer on a level where it's not just a conversation, it's like actually going through the process yourself and learning so much about how they came to that conclusion. I thought that for me was one of the most fascinating things. It was like, why did you pick this and why are we doing it like this? And they always had an answer. And I could learn from their reasoning as much as I could learn from their actual process itself. And I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at contract brewing. You can absorb so much knowledge from other people, not necessarily to take and directly do in your bits, although if you can, that's amazing. But actually just to learn their reasoning and why they picked that. For example, they had new technology and they picked it. How was that? And why did they pick that? And how's that influenced their beer? And then it can actually help you make better decisions in the future, both as a brewery and as a brewer. Say I was working in a brewery that had a mash filter. It was probably going to be very unlikely for me to see that for a long period of time. It just wasn't, at that time, wasn't really what craft breweries were using. But I got to do that. And it was really interesting for me to go there and basically absorb all of the information on how to run a mash filter, for example, and also how to make craft beer on a mash filter, which at that stage was basically not use it like a mash filter at all and butcher all their efficiency, much to their absolute total dismay. But yeah, there was a really nice way of looking at contract brewing sometimes is it's not just making beer, but it's actually also absorbing people's knowledge and experiences. And I think exactly what you said earlier. It's like, it's almost like being able to go to work in someone's brewery without actually having to work in it. So you can just basically spend that. If you're working with a brewery for a year, you'll learn just as much as if you're working there for 6 months, 8 months. So you can do this in 7 breweries, for example. You can learn so much from what other people are doing. And sometimes, just as importantly, you can learn from what people are doing wrong as well. So you can look and be like, that's a disaster. We definitely will never make that mistake. Which again is really interesting.
It's like going to uni.
Yeah.
It's like to uni back again.
Yeah, it really is. Really is. Especially, as I said, if you're picking a brewery that's bigger than yours, I mean, perfect. I mean, go look at what they've done and how they've done it, and if that's something you want to emulate or not. So yeah, one thing we haven't even touched on yet, Francesco, is why on earth do people even bother contract brewing?
Well, there are many reasons. I think the main one is because it helps you increase your production volume when the site doesn't have enough capacity. Or if in the brewery you're contracting is in a strategic geographical position, especially after Brexit, that helps a lot. And another reason it could be you're building a new brewing facility and you need to fill that gap in volume. Or maybe ultimately, if you don't have a brewery, but you still want to brew your own beer. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, that is the main reason. It's because you can basically bridge that gap. So if you've got building a new brewery or you want to build a new brewery, but you don't want to move into a brewery and not being able to utilize it properly, then you can build that volume up that way. I think it's actually quite interesting with the one with the strategic locations as well, having that brewed. I know of a brewery that I've been speaking to that, basically have their beer brewed in loads of different countries and have it so it's fresher. It actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's a lot to manage contract-wise, but it makes a lot of sense because you just negate a lot of that transport issue. I mean, as you know, if you contract brew, margins are tighter generally because someone else has got to produce it. They've got to make their own margin. But what you actually buy is you're buying flexibility, which I think is really, really important. So when market conditions drop, you don't have a production facility running at 30% utilization. You can still keep yours going, and you can basically almost think of it as like taps with contract brewing. You can just start to close them down, and you can, slow down that volume or ramp it up if you're seeing sales increase or decrease. So it's a really good way of your business becoming flexible. without actually having to produce more beer. And I mean, to give you an insight, for one company, it was over 50% of the volume, which is quite a large volume at the time. Was 50% of that was being made elsewhere by one person, effectively managing that process. So, I mean, to make 50% extra beer in your facility, you would need a lot more people, a lot more equipment, a lot more technology. So it can be a really nice way of doing so, is basically increasing your volume without having that large operational burden, so to speak.
Yeah, true. Or even if you're planning an expansion, probably before doing a big jump, good to test the market is something flexible, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've covered why you should contract brew, but Francesco, why should you brew other people's beer?
Well, there is a financial point of view we didn't touch, because we talked a lot about the learning curve that can come out of it. But financially talking, I think it's important and beneficial because on both sides, because maybe if you are contracting somewhere else and gradually you're increasing your volumes, I guess you can always negotiate a better price for your beer being brewed in that place. Or on the other hand, you are sure that you're getting that money for contracting beer for someone else. So that gives you like a big stability. And for experience, like when I was in Red Church, that was very reassuring because we knew that we had to send out that amount of hectoliters per month, and that was getting paid, and people were just a little bit more relaxed, and the sales team wasn't too stressed on pushing our core range. So it gives you that peace of mind, and I think it makes you work a little bit more relaxed without the stress of saying to hit those targets of sales in order to pay all the salary.
Yeah, it's often a point, isn't it, really, that when you're brewing someone else's beer, you brew it, you pack it, you send it out. You don't have to market it. You don't necessarily have to store it. You definitely don't have to sell it. So it's actually quite a nice way of getting a bit of steady income that is a lot less business management to take on, which is quite interesting. Okay, so what are the difficulties in brewing other people's beer?
Well, I think considering that it's more time consuming and you're being double checked on everything you do, it puts a bit of pressure, and ultimately you do put way more care than what you put on your own beer for some weird reason, or that's what I used to do, because I was very stressed and I was looking for validation, because I wanted to send out like the best product and just having the client happy. And so we say that for me at the time, and generally I think it's a big difficulty, because again, it takes lots of time to get things right.
Yeah, it is immensely stressful having someone else make the beer for you in the short term. It's basically really hard to get things off the ground, to get things up and running. When it's running smoothly, it's a total dream. Which actually leads me on to the question, Francesco. Do you think it's harder being a customer or a contract brewer?
Well, that's a very tough question. I think there are pros and cons, like both sides. I experienced both sides, so I give my opinion on both sides. So when you are contracting out, of course, like you have the stress and you want to have your beer as the same way you have it in your own brewery, and most of the time it's difficult to achieve that level, and it's stressful. So that's one difficulty on that side. Being somebody who brews for someone else, again, like is not an easy job, especially if you need to squish into a tight production schedule and hitting all the target and be on it all the time. And maybe that's not even the only beer you're brewing for someone else. So maybe you have different contracting. So, and everybody wants the beer brewed differently. So it's even harder to switch between different techniques, different specifications. And so again, that's a very hard question. I think like both positions are not easy. And probably like I would prefer to be on the side of the person who gets the beer to brew for someone else. If a brewery
Really?
contracting my brewery, and I would say yes, I would be very happy about it because I know how I work, and I'm kind of happy in the way I work, so I think I can deliver. So yeah, that's what I would prefer.
Yeah, I'm gonna go on the other side of the fence. So
Why?
I think it's easier to have your beer brewed somewhere else than brew it for someone else. I remember brewing for someone else, and I was like, it's just the amount of time it takes. It's definitely something you have to consider. It is not easy brewing someone else's beer, and then the specifications aren't right, or you don't hit the specifications, or the specifications aren't fair, and then things don't work. Oh my God, it used to drive me. But having your beer made elsewhere is, as you said, it is equally immensely stressful at times, especially when the volumes are much bigger than you make in your brew, because then it's, if let's say you're used to having 100 hectoliter tanks in your brewery, and now you're brewing in 600 hectoliter tanks, or even 1,000 hectoliter tanks, you know, the level of importance on that liquid is so much more, and it's all down to you. So it's good and it's bad, but I think brewing someone else's beer is like longevity difficult. Having your beer brewed at someone else's place is really, really difficult at the start, but then there is a much nicer period when it sort of plateaus out and you're just dealing with issues as they arise rather than trying to make a beer taste remotely the same.
But think about the challenge from a brewing perspective. Like, I always love to hit those specs and be like, yes, we hit it another time. Let's go on with the next one, and trying to improve yourself as a brewer, as a professional. I think that's very interesting. It's another, point of view.
Yeah. And on the other side, I think when you're having your beer made elsewhere, I honestly think that is the best way of getting to understand your beer. It's kind of slightly illogical, but the way you have to approach your beer and understanding your beer and how you can then manipulate certain things in different breweries to make it taste the same, that is a big challenge. And that is you understanding your beer on the next level. So it's like, yes, you understand your beer, making it in your own brewery, you understand, but can you make that beer in someone else's brewery taste the same? That's the challenge that I used to enjoy. So maybe it's because we're just enjoying it from two different angles. But yeah, I would always say I'd much rather have it brewed somewhere else than brew it myself.
Well, said that, I have a question for you.
Oh yeah.
Do you want to brew your beer in my brewery, as we are, on the opposite sides of the fence?
Yeah, that's actually true. Yeah. Yeah. I'll send you over a spec sheet and you nail it. Yeah, that's no problem.
Cool. Not too tight though, eh?
Yeah.
Easy.
Yeah, absolutely. Francesco, I'm going to round up this podcast, I think, and you can add some bits that maybe I've missed. But I think for anyone listening who's looking to basically establish a contract brewer, or maybe they've got a contract brewer already and they're looking to maybe see if they're check where they're at, I think the keys are just, as you say, you mentioned a lot through the podcast, but communication is key between both parties. And communication is not just, I'm saying, emails and verbal communication. It's also establishing that what you want out of this deal, like the volumes, the price, and the quality, and making sure that that's understood, that they have to nail those, or they have to hit those specifications of all of that. I'd say visit the brewery as much as you possibly can, establish like relationships with the people. And I mean, don't just go meet the head brewer or the managers or the owners, meet everyone, meet the people who are actually going to be making your beer, and talk to them and get them to understand and buy into what you're doing. It's really good. Taste the beer the whole way through, both your side and also when you're having it made elsewhere. So if you're just so when you go around, you're doing spot checks or you're doing checks of fermentations, you can taste a fermentation day 2 and go, that's on track. I don't need to worry about that for now. Or spot an issue before it becomes further down the line. So always taste your beer the whole way through your own process, but then also doing that as much as you can in the contract brewing facility as well. I think one thing I learned the most, maybe people will dispute this, but the beer is going to taste different. So just get over it. It is nearly impossible to emulate your beer in another brewery like that. And considering all the, not just the process factors, but the human factors, transport factors, ingredient factors, storage factors. It's so many things going in. It's actually, you just think of it, it's so complex. So just get over it and do what you can to manage it, to make sure that basically you and your team and your customers can barely discern a difference. But if you look deep enough, there's always going to be one. And they said foundations specifications are the foundation of a good working relationship. So it's not a collab. You're not there to bash out ideas on how things should be done. This is your beer. Treat it like that, and someone is making that for you. I would also consider having a service level agreement written. And as you said earlier, when we did it, we actually found it really valuable down the line when things weren't going right to be like, well, this is what we agreed to do. And it can also act as, in a way, like a reference book. So if something's going wrong or something's not right, then there's something just written and signed by both parties. So it's not a legally binding document. I don't need to take it too intense, but I think it's nice that for when someone goes to sign something, they actually always spend the time to check it. So it's a nice way of going through that as well. And yeah, basically just learn as much as you can. Go to breweries, learn from them, learn what they're doing, and learn from different people's experiences and knowledge, etc. And I think that can be like one of the most valuable side things from a contract brewing, aside from the financials and the volume gains. Is actually like you as a brewery and you as a brewer team, like you learn so much from the whole process. Anything else you want to add into that, Francesco?
Oh, well, I think we covered many points. We went above and beyond through this contract topic. And I agree with everything you said, like just now. And it makes absolutely sense to contract for many reasons. And if you are a brewer and you have the chance to brew someone else's beer, take it. For sure, you're going to learn something new. Maybe you're going to learn how to do something that you never done before, or maybe you're going to learn how to not do something, which sometimes it's more valuable.
Exactly, yeah. And I will say to anyone who's listening in, if any of you are contract brewing or have any specific questions, like honestly, please reach out to me. And I'm sure Francesco would also be keen to hear anyone's questions, or if they've had experiences or something they want to double check. As I said, I've done this for many years, and I appreciate how sometimes it can be a bit isolating being in charge of some contract brewing things. So just honestly, come hit me up, LinkedIn, Instagram, whatever. I'd really like to hear from anyone who's doing it and their experiences with it. I'm sure Francesco would too.
Yeah, absolutely. As long as you don't write me in German. Didn't learn that yet.
Yeah, I mean, Francesco can speak 5 languages and I can barely speak 1. So if you're coming out from any other language that isn't English, then you definitely should be going to Francesco.
Oh, come on, you had a great Spanish back in the day.
Yeah, 2 months of Duolingo, baby. Well, thank you so much for listening, everyone. And thank you, Francesco, for being on the show. I appreciate taking time out of your super busy schedule over at Beer Works. So thanks for coming on the show and sharing your knowledge on contract brewing.
Thanks for having me, and thanks to the listeners who's going to listen up.
Yep, thank you. Cheers, mate. Take care.
Bye. Ciao.
Brilliant. Really enjoyed that one. It's so nice and refreshing to hear someone you used to work with and how far they've come throughout their career, and relying on the experiences we had way back in the day. I want to reiterate, anyone wants to reach out, that'd be great. The next episode is going to be out in a couple of weeks. Really excited. I've got some really, really good guest speakers lined up. No spoilers in case some people pull out, but no spoilers, but really excited. There's going to be some really good topics coming up. So make sure you hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Modern Brewer Podcast.